would like to be there this morning, and teaching like this is certainly not as effective, nor is it what I like to be doing. I do want you to know that I went through this lesson earlier this morning, uh, and I was reminded as I was doing it about the little boy that's sitting on the front of a grocery store's step, and there were big watermelons there. And the owner said, "I'll give you $1 if you can eat that watermelon, the whole watermelon." And the little boy was gone for a while and came back and ate the watermelon without any problem. And the man gave him the $1. And the man asked him, "Well, where did you go?" He said, "Well, we had a watermelon at home just like this one. And I went home and I ate it just to make sure I could." That's why I ran through this lesson earlier today, just to make sure I could. But uh, I wish I could teach it like I have done several times in my easy chair early in the morning, just between that REM sleep that we go into that deep sleep and what I call the tire sleep. That's where you're waking up and knowing that the rubber's going to have to meet the road. Well, I can do a much better job when it's silently done, and you would probably enjoy it better if I did so. However, I'm going to do my best in doing what I can do with the lesson from this vantage point. I went on a journey about 4 weeks ago. I was challenged by a friend of mine to read a book. He is African American, a good friend, and we Zoom every week. And of course, he challenged me to read a book entitled Post Traumatic Slave Syndrome. And I went on that journey there, and I listened to that book, and I would recommend the lectures to you all as well, because I believe the doctor who was presenting it has a very good message and really a way to hang some of the issues that we see among people who are survivors. I read also a book called Touching the Void, which was a story about a man mountain climbing and ultimately had to cut the rope of his friend, thinking that as a result, they both would eventually die, but they didn't. And they wrote the story. It's a wonderful story about survivors. I began that journey by listening also to uh, POW stories, particularly because of Karen's brother-in-law and getting to know a little about him. I listened to many of his lectures. Also, I read the book Tap to see how people survived the POW camps. And so I went from that to listen to many of the Holocaust interviews and people who's told the stories of living through the Holocaust. And also I listened to many slave people talking about how they endured slavery. Lena and I had actually visited the Hanoi Hilton, where Gene spent 5.5 years along with John McCain and others that were there, and they told the stories of survival. I remember as I looked back over literature and as I thought through many things that every art, music, literature, sculpting, even architects makes an effort to tell the story of mercy being extended. My most, I guess, memorable book is Les Miserables, that tells the story of sin and redemption. But many of these talk about justice. And I went on a journey of trying to decipher the difference between justice and mercy. In this story today, as you look at this picture before you, I'm not going to try to give a message or to interpret this picture for you. You can do that for yourself because the picture actually tells a story without words. I could describe for you a sunset like Floyd sees as he sits at his swing looking to the west, but it's not like seeing the picture that I've seen of Floyd sitting there looking at the beauty of a sunset. And many of you have stood before the disasters of life, and like this couple, and God has extended mercy to you. Well, what this story is today, or our message today, is a story of how God works in the ninth chapter of Matthew to extend mercy to those that are told about in the story. You'll wait just a minute. I'm having difficulty moving my text forward. Well, I may have to go just to reading my screen. Hold on just a moment. Let me do something else. Maybe this is it. There we go. Okay. Can you still see the screen okay, Larry?
Yeah, we can.
Oh, okay. This is the flow of the lesson today. We'll look at an overview of Matthew 9, then we'll look at the focal text, and then I'm going to talk briefly about the themes of mercy and justice. And that's the flow. First of all, we'll look at Matthew 9. I'm going to minimize this right here so I can see my screen. Okay, okay. I don't mean it, but Matthew 9 is introducing us to a plethora of people who need grace or mercy extended to them. The text tells us that Jesus was going back to his home and he was immediately met by a friend bringing a paralyzed or someone bringing a paralyzed friend to Jesus. And seeing their faith, Jesus says to the paralyzed man, "Take heart, your sins are forgiven." And the religious leaders think he's blaspheming because only God can forgive sins. And to prove his authority, Jesus heals the man who gets up and he walks away. As we read that, we can see the key points are that Jesus just is with his divine authority not only heals bodies, but he forgives sins, showing he is God. To keep that in mind, we come to the difficulties of our life, and sometimes we think that the mission of God is to get us out of that difficulty, but that's not the main mission. Faith in Christ brings both spiritual and sometimes physical restoration. And so here in the first encounter, we have Jesus being one who speaks with authority and brings about good in a person's life. And verse 8 describes, I think, what is important, and that is when the crowds saw it, they were afraid and they glorified God who had given such authority to men. That's the first encounter. again, I'm going to have to make some kind of change here. You go back. Okay. We move forward. Okay. Then, secondly, we see the calling of Matthew. Of course, Matthew was a hated man because he had sold out his soul, really, to be a tax collector. As you know, may remember that tax collectors could collect taxes for the Roman government, but they had a certain amount that they were to present to the government, but then they could add whatever they chose to that, and that would become theirs. And they were oppressed by Matthew and certainly didn't want him in their company. But they couldn't imagine why would Jesus extend mercy and call a man like Matthew. But Jesus welcomed the sinners and he welcomes us. And the last part of this text says, those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. Go and learn what this means. I desire mercy and not sacrifice, for I came not to call righteous, but sinners. Now, we'll look a little closer to that later on. Then the next encounter is regarding fasting. If you have not exercised the discipline of fasting, I'd encourage you to do that. It is a very good spiritual discipline. But the Pharisees fasted not necessarily for spiritual benefit, but mostly they did that in order to be recognized for their faithfulness and perhaps even their sacrifice. But they questioned Jesus because the disciples were not fasting as they did. And Jesus gives them a beautiful picture of what it means to what fasting and feasting mean. He said, at a marriage feast, while you have the bridegrooms with you, that's a time for feasting. But when the groom is gone, that is the time to fast. He says, I'm bringing a new era to your religious faith. He says, no one takes an unstrengthened cloth and ties that or patches an old garment with it. If the person does so, it's going to tear it apart. And then he goes on to talk about nobody takes good wine or new wine, I should say, and put it into old wineskins. If one does that, then it bursts. Jesus was ushering in something quite different. That is, he was ushering in that faith that enabled him to exercise extend mercy to others. Then we have next a girl who is restored to life, and a woman who is healed. At the synagogue, he was there, and the daughter is sick, and he raises her, and he immediately encounters a woman with the issue of blood. And all of this is amazing to the people. And the 26th verse says, and the report of this went through all that district. And I can imagine how quickly it did, having done these kinds of miracles. And then he encounters two blind men, and they express what is extended. Have mercy on us, son of a David. And Jesus heals them and they spread the news everywhere, going everywhere, telling people what Jesus has done for them. And then he has the healing of a mute and a demons-possessed man. He casts out the demons, and we hear a man who has never spoken before speaking now. And then lastly, in the overview, we have the compassion of the crowds, people who are amazed, and they are like sheep without a shepherd. And he's come there, but he's moved with compassion. He sees all these people in need of what he has to provide for them, and Jesus has compassion on them. Now we're going to move next to our focal text. And Larry, if the mic is on, I'm going to ask first someone read the first text, and that is Matthew 9:10 through 13.
While he was reclining at the table in the house, many tax collectors and sinners came to eat with Jesus and his disciples. When the Pharisees saw this, they asked his disciples, "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?" Now, when he heard this, he said, "It is not those who are well who need a doctor, but those who are sick. Go and learn what this means. I desire mercy and not sacrifice, for I didn't come to call the righteous, but sinners."
Thank you, Larry. That, for me, is the mission that Jesus came to accomplish. Now, oftentimes we think we should not associate with certain people, but salt cannot be a preservative unless it's applied to meat. Light cannot be its greatest unless it is that which shines in the darkness. So what Jesus is establishing is quite contrary to how the Pharisees lived. The Pharisees, the word itself implies being separate. And also it takes on a sense of arrogance, also of privilege, and etc. You may remember the story when Saul was given a charge to go into war, but not to bring anything back from that war. Make sure everything is destroyed. This came from Samuel to Saul. Saul went about doing his job as he went into battle, and then Samuel went to him because he wanted to talk with him, and Saul began to tell him about all he had accomplished in battle, and it was then that Samuel said, "What is the meaning of the bleating of the sheep?" And Saul then began to tell him how much they had brought back, all the things that they had brought back that they were going to offer in a sacrifice to God. And it was then that Samuel declared that Saul's reign as king was over. And he said, God does not delight, if you look down in the text, the larger text, God does not, he asked the question, does the Lord delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as much as in obeying the Lord? So Samuel was saying that it is better to obey, that is, Saul, you should have done what I told you to do, rather than to offer a sacrifice. Obedience, as we have said over and again throughout our teaching, every one of our teachers have said, trust and obey is a simple thing that we are called to do. And here, Jesus is saying to the Pharisees that I am extending my mercy to those that you don't affiliate with, to the down and out, those who are displaced, those that are looked upon by others as being less than themselves. On and on I can go. In essence, our faith and our Jesus's mission is to look upon the world where there is injustice, where there are weak people who are being denied, on, and people who need protection. It is our responsibility to extend mercy as did Jesus, so that that kind of person, that kind of life is covered by the protection that we have out of our commitment to Christ. That's what Jesus came to do. Now, it appears that these people were coming for the physical part of it, that is, to be given sight, to be able to walk again, etc. And many of the people focused on that. But his mission was more than that. The mission of bringing salvation to one's inner being, his psyche, his soul, that which will return to God. And we'll look closer at that shortly. Then we look at his work. Someone read the 14 through 17, please.
Then John's disciples came to him, saying, Why do we and the Pharisees fast often, but your disciples do not fast? Jesus said to them, Can the wedding guests be sad while the groom is with them? The time will come when the groom will be taken away from them, and then they will fast. No one patches an old garment with unshrunk cloth, because the patch pulls away from the garment and makes the tear worse. And no one puts new wine into old wineskins, otherwise the skins burst. The wine spills out and the skins are ruined. No, they put new wine into fresh wineskins, and both are preserved.
Thank you. And that's, in essence, saying the work of Jesus is bringing something new to the table. And what he brought to the table was not the destruction of all that has gone on in the past, but a new interpretation for that. And he brought a new interpretation to fasting. He brought a new interpretation to what it means to enter into the life of another person. And so his work was to enlarge what had happened in the Old Testament when the Hebrews, who were to be the light of the world, became themselves exclusive and feeling that they were indeed the chosen of God. One of the works of art is what a movie of the Jews, and my mind is going blank right now, which regarding it's a movie about the Jews being chosen. It's a musical, and one of the Hebrews looks up to God in the midst of the trouble. It's the work is Fiddler on the Roof. It looks up to God in the midst of being thrown out and all kind of trouble. He says, God, I know that we have been the chosen ones, but can't you choose somebody else once in a while? And sometimes in the midst of our own issues, when we face those kind of things, we also say, God, can't you choose somebody else for a while? You give me a break. Well, that's what Jesus came to do, to include all people as he moved through. And then he looked on the crowds of people. And someone read verses 18 and 19 for us.
As he was telling them these things, suddenly one of the leaders came and knelt down before him, saying, My daughter just died, but come and lay your hands on her, and she will live. So Jesus and the disciples got up and followed him.
He spoke to the crowds and he had compassion on them. And in our day, of course, the world is much greater in number, even though in that ancient day there was a large group of people there. and he saw that these people who were following him were in need of what he came to do. And so he called them and they responded with by following him. Now that's our message today. But I want to move from this to talk about some of the themes in the book of Matthew, but also in this text. And I spent some time, and there's no way I can include all that I found that I would love to share with you about the connection of mercy and justice. In our day, we hear a lot about social justice, but in my understanding of my relationship to God, I'd rather not have what is just to me, but I would rather have His mercy. Anytime I would rather have the mercy of God. And so we have all kinds of symbols, even in our legal system, and everywhere you go, you'll find symbols of justice. And the scale, the Lady Justice herself speaks out to us just in the sculpture itself. The scales are rooted in the weighing of souls in ancient Egypt. The balanced scales represent the weighing of evidence and the impartiality of the law. The sword represents authority and the power to punish. The sword conveys that justice is swift and final. It is typically a double-edged sword, meaning it can rule in favor or against either party. The blindfold was added, I think, in the 16th century. Initially, it had been used satirically to represent the law's blindness to its own abuses, but it eventually came to symbolize the ideal of impartiality. As I was listening to Trey Gowdy recently, he made a comment that really struck me when he said justice is not blind, but blindfolded. And then the attorney that I'm going to talk about you soon at the end says a prosecuting attorney seeks justice, not a guilty verdict. There's other information you read as I move forward. We also, those of you in the medical profession, are familiar with this symbol, but it's connected with mercy, a symbol of forgiveness, of compassion, and healing. And but these two symbols are, to me, things that represent in our daily life about justice and mercy. But these comments I'm going to read because they're so impactful. First, we understand that God's justice means He always acts in accordance with what is right and fair. Now, skip down to the next paragraph. Because God is just, sin cannot go unpunished. Sin is a transgression against God's holy law and an offense to His righteous character. This is where God's justice demands a penalty. But then the next one, I think, puts it all together. His infinite love and mercy, God always provided a way for justice to be satisfied while offering forgiveness to humanity. This is beautifully displayed in the person and work of Jesus Christ, who was the sacrifice, satisfying the demands of God's justice on our behalf. Through his death and resurrection, God's justice was upheld. His mercy was extended to all who repent of their sins and place their faith in Jesus. Then, for those who do repent and believe, God declares them righteous. Our ultimate justice will be perfectly administered at the final judgment. Believers are called to pursue justice and righteousness in their daily lives as an outpouring of their faith and love for God. George Washington said, Lady Justice remains the most recognized symbol of American judicial system. While her form varies, sometimes seated, sometimes standing, sometimes clear-eyed, and sometimes blindfolded, her core attributes of the sword and scales continue to represent the pillars of good judgment, as was said by George Washington. I'll not read all of this, but simply the first part. Mercy in the biblical sense is God's compassionate withholding of deserved punishment and his active benevolence toward the undeserving. That's what this lesson is about, that he speaks to those who do not and extends his mercy to those who do not deserve it. I read this. This is the lawyer, what I want to talk about. Johnny D. McMillan was on death row for nearly 6 years, convicted of murder. But later they found that there was no way that he could have committed the crime. Ralph Myers was a convicted criminal who told the truth. As a result, he was freed. But the prosecutor even introduced McMillan's relationship with a white woman, Karen Kelly, to imply the motive. But the attorney, Brian Stevenson, argued against the conviction. And ultimately, the 60 Minutes revealed this story, and he was acquitted, and a book and a movie was made entitled Just Mercy. As I've listened to this, I see how easily it is for us to declare somebody guilty when they are not. But God is able to extend his mercy even to us who are undeserving. As he walked across this area, that's exactly what he did with each person he encountered. He brought mercy and delayed the justice in order to provide for those people. These are the things that we can take away from the lesson. We can trust that Jesus came to offer salvation to sinners, represented in all that we've seen today. We can rejoice in the truth that salvation is not based on religious works or rituals. We cannot do what the Pharisees did with their rituals and obeying the law. We can know that Jesus cares and will respond to our needs. We can trust him and trust that he has the power to transform our lives as he extends mercy to us as he did to those we have encountered in this lesson today. Now, we'll take a moment. If you have any comments, afterwards I'll turn it over to Karen and those who are going to do the prayer list. Anybody with any comments?
As you read, you apply the text here. you see so much on social media these days. Something happens and you're either convicted or you're innocent immediately. Because social media jumps on it and everybody's right when they post there. I'm glad that God doesn't see things that way, that God responds in a different way. He knows what's going on and he judges us accordingly, as opposed to what happens in the world today. Just my opinion.